Hello, welcome to the Platonic Studies channel. This is another video in an ongoing series on Plato's Euthyphro. So, let's begin. This next section addresses what Socrates did to have the charge brought up against him in the first place. So I'll begin by reading the Greek and then reading my own translation of the Greek. Euthyphron. Buloimien an o Socrates al orodo mia tunantion geniatai. A technos garmoi doke afestias archestai, cacurgentien polin, epicheron adicense, cae moilege, ticait poiunta se fiesi diafteren tus neus. Socrates. Atopa o thaumasie, os uto gacusai, fiesigar me poietien enai theon, cae os cainus poiunta theus. Tus de arcaius uno misonta e grapsato, tuton afton heneca hos fiesin. And the translation is, I wish this were the case, O Socrates, but I fear lest the opposite should come about. For simply it seems to me that he begins from the most sacred place, and harms the city by attempting to wrong you. Yet speak to me, doing what does he accuse you of corrupting the youth? Strange things, when simply heard. For he says that I am a maker of gods, and that I am making new gods, and I am not considering the ancient ones to be worthy of respect. Because of these things he indicts me, so he says. Euthyphro continues, and he basically says, buloimen, which means I wish it were so, or I wish it was. It's optative of bulomai, which means to wish, or I wish. Here it's an optative. You can tell by the oi here. And that basically means, it basically means I wish it were the case. I wish it were. Followed by the particle on, which indicates further that it's a optative. O Socrates, the vocative of the word Socrates, so O Socrates, addressing him. But, Allah, orodo, I fear. And whenever you have a verb of fearing, it'll oftentimes be in the Platonic corpus followed by the particle mie. This usually is a negative, negating particle used in like imperatives. But in this case, there's a verb that comes after it in the subjunctive. So in this case, it says, but I fear lest it would happen. Ginontai, or ginomai, means to arise or to happen. And what is it that is he fears arising? Tunantion. This is a word that means the opposite. So to and antion. So it's smushed together, so it becomes tu, but it's to and antion, so the opposite. The next section begins with ateknos, an adverb, which means simply or without artifice. Gar, which is a connecting particle, which basically in this instance could be translated as because or for. So he says, for simply, it appears to me, moidoke, very common. It appears to me that he begins. Now, he is left out. So it's assumed, per the last video, that Miletus is the person we're talking about. So it seems to me that he begins. And where does he begin? From the hearth, which is also oftentimes where the altar was in the house. So, and then the next verb is kakurgen, which means to do evil or to work bad deeds. And then it takes an accusative, so tien polin. So polis is the nominative form. This is the accusative, indicated by the definite article. And then followed by a participle, epicheron, which means attempting to do evil or to wrong, really, more to do wrong against you or to wrong you. Adicense. Kai moi lege. Lege is imperative. He's saying, speak to me, O Socrates. So moi is dative, so speak to me. What actually doing you is what this literally means. So what actually, kai can be also, and, or actually. In this case, I think actually would work better. Poi unta, doing, se. Now these are both in the accusative. And the reason is because we have a verb of saying here. So he says, Euthyphron says, what does he say? Once again, militus is the assumed subject here. What does he say that you are doing? Whenever you have a verb of saying, it'll oftentimes throw everything that is being talked about, whether it's a person or a thing, into the accusative, and then whatever that thing is that the person is saying they're doing, into the verb, into the infinitive. Or in this case, since it's a participle, it'll also be in the accusative. So accusative in the participle, accusative in the pronoun, and then also in the main verb, diaphterein, which means to corrupt, that's also in the infinitive. So this literally translates as, what actually does he say that you're doing to corrupt? And then to corrupt takes an accusative noun, the young. So what actually does he say you doing to corrupt the young? Socrates replies to Euthyphro's question of what he did exactly to deserve the charges that Miletus has brought against him by saying that they are strange things that Miletus accuses him of. Atopa, which means actually means things that occur nowhere. Topos is place, and is the aprivative, so stuff that occurs nowhere. But it generally translates as strange things. Then comes a Platonic idiom, which occurs in a few places, but it basically means on first hearing. So hos huto gakusai. So you can almost break it up and say hos is when, uto is thus or simply hearing. So when simply hearing or when thus hearing. So it's an idiom that just means when you first hear something. It occurs in a few other spots in the Platonic corpus. Then he follows that up by saying, because he says, fiasi gar. Gar is because, or for, and fiasi is he says. Once again, melitos. And like we said before, when there's a verb of saying, it oftentimes throws everything into the accusative and infinitive construction. So here's a pronoun. It's first person pronoun, me, as in Socrates. For he says me, a maker, poietien, to be, of the gods. For he says that I am a maker of the gods, is how we would say it in English. And he continues with the accusative infinitive construction by saying, and that, hos oftentimes with a verb of saying will be translated as that, like hoti, fiasi hos, kainus, new, gods, kainus, theus. And there's a participle in between these two, between the adjective and the noun. And once again, it's still in the accusative participle. And the old gods, I do not consider worthy, or I take consideration of. So altogether, for he says that I am a maker of gods, and that making new gods, and the old ones not considering worthy of respect. For these things, he indicts me. Egorapsato. We discussed that in episode 2 or 3. Egorapso is to indict. It also means to write, but in this case, it's indict. And then henaka is for the sake of these things, or because. It's a different way of saying because, or in exchange oftentimes as well. It can mean in exchange. But in this case, because of these things, he indicts me. And then he caps that all off by saying, so he says, as he says.